I have, in moving towards introducing our next speaker, I have a small courtesy to attend to. It may be the kind of courtesy that's done when the person's not back to the barn yet, and he'll wave at you later. But my good friend Doug Morrow is here with us today. Doug, you're not in here, are you, yet? He'll wave at you later. We all have a Land Institute story, everybody who's here, how we got here, how we got connected with the place, with the people, with the ideas. And my Land Institute story starts with Doug Morrow. He is today a diplomat with the U.S. State Department. He's fresh in from Prague. But way back when Doug and I were still caterpillars, he was going to Pomona College in California, and I was at University of Missouri. He was aware that I was kind of wrestling with my identity as a farm kid and my growing identity as an environmentalist. And he said, you know, a few weeks ago, I went to this visiting speaker. I went to see him at Pomona, this guy, Wes Jackson. I think he might be on your wavelength here, and that kicked it off. That seed, as Leonard would have just put it there, that was planted at almost a unique watershed moment in my life where I could do some thinking and I could orient a lot of life decisions around this place. I got over here within about 4 months of learning of it. The year was 2000. And things have unwound since then. So my Land Institute story starts with Doug Morrow. And the reason that I fit this in here is that it in some ways couldn't be a better introduction to our next speaker, who also happens to be Wes Jackson, just like at Pomona those years ago. I've described Wes before from this podium as somebody who's maybe chiefly the founder of a movement. And what I've just described to you is a tiny example of how a movement works, that there are ripples and ripples that cause more ripples. And over time, people coalesce, ideas are generated, and things change. So I will simply introduce to you Wes Jackson as somebody who decades ago saw that the surface of the pond was a little too smooth and performed a hell of a cannonball right into the middle of it. And those ripples are still spreading. So here today, Wes Jackson.
There are a few people that stood up. What the heck's happening here? Well, it's great to see you folks again and again and again. Well, now for something completely different. 3 years ago, I quit being president. Fred came on board, and people say to me, repeatedly, so how's retirement going? And I have to know, I'm still on the staff. They got to pay me. And so I've been working, thinking about stories. But they have to be stories that somehow or another relate to the modern problem for which climate change sums it best. So under this big canopy is a whole bunch of stuff that has been going on. Soil erosion, chemical contamination of the land and water, fossil fuel dependency, destruction of the forests, destruction of species extinctions, I don't have a halo, but I don't want that. So I've been writing some stories, but also thinking about a creaturely worldview. We've had the ecosystem as the conceptual tool all of these years since '77. And if you look at the hierarchy of structure, from atoms to molecules to cells to tissues to organs to organisms, the next is ecosystem and then ecosphere. And we have this ecosphere studies program. Aubrey is in charge of that, and you'll hear more of that later. But what does the organism have to offer? And so when we think about a creaturely worldview, we're not thinking about the industrial mind. We're thinking about what does it mean to be a creature, going back to that early time on Earth in that first journey from minerals to cells. That journey from minerals to cells that they now have the framing. There's still a lot to be filled in, but the framing is there. So we can have the industrial mind reign, we can have human cleverness, or we can have nature's wisdom as the dominant idea, and that's pretty much what I think we need to be featuring, because it's been a 4.5 billion year journey featuring the creatures, and this Johnny-come-lately thing called an industrial revolution is one day, if we're successful, be so passe. So I have a book now with help with a lot of people that know lots of things. And I have 31 stories. And if the publisher really likes it, well, maybe next year or a little longer, you'll be able to read some of those stories. Depends on how many they throw out. But I'm going to tell you 6 stories today. So I think a good beginning has to do with how we all got started. Because people are forever asking, how did you ever get the Land Institute started? And so here is the story, and you will see later there are stories and there are stories. So we had been back. I do need this light. I was waiting on the glow. We had been back to our house and home on our 28 acres just outside Salina for 2 years. This is the opening story of the volume. Then came the call from Sacramento, a call I figured was coming but dreaded. I was told unequivocally that I had to either return to my position at Cal State Sacramento or resign. It was as simple as that. From a professional sense, I had a good job with tenure in the academic world. I'd been granted a 1-year leave that I stretched into 2, and so the choice, security in California, a decent salary, health benefits, security, money, health benefits, were not here in Kansas. Sacramento, the capital, had clear water of the American River that came right by the campus out of the western slope of the Sierra Nevada, the back door of our house. We had several friends, lots of intellectual engagement, and if we wanted to do anything politically, we were in the capital of a large state. where the levers of power for both the state and federal offices were within minutes. The Sierra Nevada loomed up to the east on a clear day. The Central Valley of California, with its variety of agricultural crops, lay to the south, and the Pacific Ocean, with its public beaches, were a short trip west. And so, here we had all of these wonderful accoutrements of civilization. UC, University of California, Davis, less than a half hour away. We could go to San Francisco, the redwoods on the coast, or the Central Valley, or to Lake Tahoe, and hike in the mountains along a trail toward the peaks. Lots going on in California for our family. And when we left, we planned to return after 1 year. So I began to wonder, so why did we sell the house, which bordered the American River, with its hiking and biking trail along the levee, which bordered the backyard? What could have been our minds to want to return for even a year to Salina? The next large city west of Salina was Denver, 435 miles away. The next larger than Salina town to the east was Topeka, 110 miles away. Kansas City was nearly 3 hours away. No mountains, no ocean, no variety of fruits and vegetables, no Central Valley, no UC Davis close by, no UC Berkeley or East Bay, no Stanford on the peninsula. What Salina had to offer was 28 acres with a flat roof, 1,300 square foot house, partly finished on the bank of the Smoky Hill River. The average rainfall was 28 inches, not bad, but also in the Dust Bowl corridor of the 30s. Salina had also been a primary nuclear target for the USSR, given the Schilling Air Base had only recently had B-52 bombers loaded with nuclear weapons, ready every night to head north toward Russia. And there were a few intercontinental missile silos, and they were right nearby. The base had been recently shut down, but the missile silos remained. The shutdown led to a population decline in Salina, a scramble to keep the economy going. For God's sake, what were we going back to? We had a family in and around Topeka. My mother was still alive, and so it was my siblings and their families, many of whom had traveled to visit us in California, where we would take them to see the redwoods, to Chinatown, Fisherman's Wharf, ride the cable cars, go up Lombard Street. We'd be able to see them from time to time. What was being so close to home? Why was that an excuse to stay? As parents, we worried about the future and how we might prepare ourselves and our children to have the best skills, which is to say, have the know-how to get along during periods of scarcity. We did want to see what it would be like to live closer to subsistence level. We had the milk cow, the butcher hog, chickens for meat and eggs, and my then wife, Dana, was a good gardener, became a good beekeeper. We put the kids to work where all three learned skills without knowing it. But now, with 2 years of this marginal life behind us, with lumber buzzed up by a local sawmill and a shop made mostly from scrap lumber, well, we somehow managed, and we were young. Sacramento called. We need to know, return or resign. What to do? We had no money. I'd do welding job here and there. Dana did some substitute teaching. Back in Sacramento, I often stared at the ceiling at night thinking about the ideal school for college-age students. I'd read up on Deep Springs College in California, Berea College in Kentucky, which combined intellectual rigor with hands-on work. I wondered if anything like that could spout up in Kansas. With no money and high insecurity, there was one more card to play in the decision. Kansas State Senator John Simpson lived in Salina. He was an attorney. He and his then-wife Diane invited us to their home for a weenie roast in their yard. As Joan and I sat roasting our weenies or marshmallows, he inquired about what we intended to do. I told him about the choice facing me and that I had been thinking of the ideal school. He quickly replied, "If you want to start a school, I'll help you." Now we had an option: stay and start a school. This required a family decision, which included the sort of school I imagined. But there was the insecurity. John offered to pay half the tuition for any student. With John Simpson's offer on the table, the five of us assembled in the house to discuss the pros and cons of staying. It seemed to me it'd be too risky to stay. If it didn't work out, well, the options would be greatly reduced. And so I said, we better go back. At that point, Laura, still 15, burst into tears and said, "I thought you said that we're not called to success, but to obedience to our vision." Hoo boy. I resigned and we stayed. So countless over the years, I've been asked what led to the decision to leave California and start the land. There would be the somber acknowledgement that it was the wisdom and high morality of the youth that had the high ideals that brought the Land Institute into existence. My. Think of that. Out of the mouths of babes, a child will lead us. The biblical implications huge. And we see this with the young woman now, with the climate from Sweden. And so on. For more than 43 years, I told something close to this same story. But as the old commentator Paul Harvey had in the Midwest would say every afternoon on the radio after the ad, now for the rest of the story. On June 15 of this year, my wife Joan and I are in Cedar Falls, Iowa, in the home of Laura. Her husband, Kamyar, and daughter, Ada. Nada, their oldest, at 23, and out of college, but came from Minneapolis. We were there to celebrate two birthdays, Kamyar's 50th, 2 days later, and my 83rd that day. It was also Kamyar's 40th year since leaving Iran. Some 25 or 30 friends and guests of Kamyar and Laura were seated here and there around the room, on the sofa, at tables, on the steps, in groups of 2, 3, 4, 5. Someone asked me the question. I motioned toward Laura with the back of my hand and say, "She's the reason." Then I tell the story I had told thousands of times over 4 decades. Once again, the hearers seemed amazed, offering thoughtful nods and such. There are looks toward Laura. She says, "Well, there's more to that story." We had moved 7 times, and I'd gone to 7 different schools. I didn't want to move again, and I knew that if I threw one of Dad's lines back at him, I wouldn't have to change schools again. I was astonished. I had lived with a good story. My incomplete story with almost mythical proportions. It was the first time I'd ever told the story with Laura present. I instantly had a flashback to the times we were raising our kids, where it was a near tradition among our family members to break highfalutin balloons to offer a harder truth. Any sweet or romantic story, any high thought was fair game to take a matter to some material, energy, or selfish motive. Those are my kids. No high tone should go unchallenged. Well, Laura got what she wanted. She also continues to bring any high-sounding motivation down. So there it is. The Land Institute came into existence because a 15-year-old girl didn't want to change schools again. There are stories, and there are stories. And that's the introduction to my book. The second story has to do with E.F. Schumacher when he visited the land in March of 1977. Dr. Schumacher was a Rhodes Scholar and an economist, and the author of a popular book titled Small is Beautiful, Economics as If People Mattered. Published in '73, he toured America, at once promoting his book, promoting his ideas. He paid a day-and-a-half visit to the land in March of '77 and died on a train the following August in Europe. I found out he was going to be in the U.S. from the president of Doane College in Crete, Nebraska, and of course invited him to the land. Board member Sam Evans provided the Evans Grain Company plane for the trip from and to Nebraska. We had dinner with TLI board members in the home of founding board member John Simpson and his wife, had a tour of the land. In the evening lecture, Schumacher told some memorable stories, and I will tell two of those in a moment, but first, a bit about the walk around the land. Mind you, our startup was scarcely 7 months old. On top of all that, the classroom building had burned down 6 weeks after we started, with no insurance on the building, as the company was figuring out how to cover a nonprofit related to an owner. They were slow in getting us insured. So we had no money. We had accumulated junk that seemed to hold promise someday for use in building this and that, eventually. We intended to have wind machines and solar collectors, which we eventually did. But here and there was iron and wood, fit mostly for most people's idea of a junk pile. We managed to acquire 225 patio doors from a company that had gone out of business. Some were double planes, some were single, but there they were in a pile as Schumacher and I toured the premises. The place looked worse than all of that, given that the terraces on half of the property had just been built, and here was this vast area with fresh dirt recently gouged out and thrown up. It did look terrible, and Schumacher asked me with a tone of bewilderment, "My God, what is going on here?" I explained the land had been seriously eroded and I wanted to stop it. He quickly responded, "Have you thought of trees?" Well, I had read J. Russell Smith's tree book and had fully intended to plant the millwood variety of honey locust that reportedly would yield 1,800 pounds of sugar per acre. Oh yeah, we're into that, all right. But now back to the patio doors. He paused in front of them and I asked a question that had been bothering me for a long time. Is it right, as we think of sustainable sunshine future, to be drawing so heavily on the products of the Industrial Revolution, since the Industrial Revolution is such a big part of the problem? He said nothing as he walked a few feet away, then stopped, turned, and said, "Never mind. Materials want to be used. They will show you how." You, dear listener, remember that the book that made him famous, Small is Beautiful, it featured Buddhist economics. He called it so, explaining that if it was the same as Christian economics, but it was the same as Christian economics, but had he called it that, no one would want the book. So right there was a contrast. The Buddhists had said that materials want to be used, and I'll show you how. And my secularized Methodist Christian mind wanted to know, should we be using this stuff as a result of the fallen world we live in? So much for the tour. And now for a story. One of the most memorable stories had to do with Schumacher telling about lorries carrying biscuits from Edinburgh to London. Meet lorries carrying biscuits from London to Edinburgh. I wondered, he said, that they didn't exchange recipes. Then he added, but then I'm just an economist, and there must be something about the added value of the transport. Well, I've saved his most memorable story, though, for the last. He told how he and some friends toured across the U.S. right through our part of the country. It was at the height of the Great Depression, he said, when he and his fellows came to a small town somewhere in Kansas and stopped at a service station. He engaged a local man there in asking, "Well, how is it?" "All right," the local said. "Well, what do you do?" "I work on that farm over there," he said, pointing across the road. "So you're a farmer," said Schumacher. "Yes, I used to own that farm, but I had no money to pay the hired hand, so I paid him in land. Now he owns the farm." Well, that's a very sad story. Oh, no. He has no money either. Now he's paying me back in land. Well, it was a charming talk. Our community theater had few empty seats that night. The locals in attendance that night got an early taste of what was to come out of the Land Institute. We still embrace his values, making his remarks a perfect launch of what we already were and to a large degree did become. I told that story in Bellagio, Italy, at the Rockefeller Place along Lake Como. By the way, don't do as I did when there, call it Lake Perry Como. I thought that would lighten the meeting up a bit, but I can tell you it didn't. And they were a bunch of economists. I told that story. I also told them the story about 3 people in Matfield Green working on perpetual motion machines. One of them had worked on it for something like, 70 years and almost had it once. And if he ever got it, the Japanese were going to pay millions, billions, he says. So I told the story about the perpetual motion machine at this conference, and then I said, there used to be a lot of trade, shade tree mechanic types back in the 60s, or in the 20s, working on perpetual motion machines. You don't see them much anymore. What's become of them? I said, I think they put on suits and ties and became economists. it was not an auspicious opening for me. All right, that's story number 2. Story number 3. My brother Harley at the European Parliament. The cast for this one-act play is my wife, Joan, my brother Harley, 8 years older than I, a German guide, and me, 4 of us. The setting is the Parliament of the European Union in Brussels, the year 2000. I'd given a short, informal talk earlier in the day to the European Greens. Now they're gone, and the European guide of us through Europe, under the direction of a nonprofit in Stockholm, resumes his obligation to show us around. All is going fine until the guide says that given the countries coming into the Union, this Parliament building would not do. They would have to build another one. With that sentence, my brother Harley leaves the 3 of us and walks to the back of the assembly hall. The German registers his departure with a glance and continues his telling to Joan and me. We listen with more than dutiful interest. I'm thinking Harley should be here listening with comparable interest, but he continues to walk to the back, looking left and right. During a short pause in the guide's narration, I receive an order from the back with a tone and urgency that I might have heard in the fields or at the barn or on the farm. There it is again. A long arm attached to a 6'3" frame, that index finger beckoning. I immediately become 8 years old. And he is 16. Or maybe I'm 12 and he's 20, it doesn't matter. I dutifully make my way to the back of the auditorium. And he had said, Sharon, my first name is Sharon. My family calls me Sharon, but not my brothers. Sharon, come here. So this time he wants my opinion. And what's on his mind? I pretty much already figured out what's on his mind, and so I'm not surprised when he asks, while thumping with the back of his hand against a wall, you think this is a bearing wall? The German guide and Joan have arrived from the front, while I study whether this is, in fact, a load-bearing wall. Harley asks the German the same question. No matter, he's already determined that it isn't, and even if so, that it could be dealt with using steel beams. He consults the German again. This space here at the back, what do they do with it? The German doesn't know. He says something about receptions, and Harley says nothing, but I know he must be thinking receptions to be frivolous, maybe even thinking they could bring their own lunch or eat at home. Well, Harley's questioning isn't over. How many did you say would be added? The German gives some ballpark approximation. Harley then begins counting seats, and number per row, and the number of rows. He sizes up the non-bearing wall of this broad at the back, pinching in at the front chamber, surveys the additional space available, if that wall remove, and declares, I don't think you need a new building. Look here, all this space here at the back. Harley didn't follow up. I suspect he thought it was enough for the German to hear and then take back to whomever may have a say about such matters. Well, I've given you a little insight there in the kind of family I grew up in. And make do, paint over, fix. Why do you need that? What are you going to do with that? What? Conversations often started with what? All right, that's the end of the third story. This one is called The Necessity to Insult the Meat. Ferocious egalitarianism. So what I'm about to describe now comes from a New Yorker article by John Lancaster, published September 11, 2017, under the title, The Case Against Civilization. Did our hunter-gatherer ancestors have it better? That piece drew on James Scott's book, Against the Grain, and a book by James Sussman titled, Affluence Without Abundance, The Disappearing World of the Bushman. Now, never mind the problem of proper citation. More importantly, just know that one of our goals and our transformative efforts is to encourage what has been called a ferocious egalitarianism. That's not our term, and it's a mouthful for sure, but no matter, it's a necessary idea, so here goes. Sussman does research in Africa with natives and says that the most valuable thing a hunter can do is come back with meat. Now, this is not the case with gathering plants, since they are not subject to any strict convention of sharing. According to Sussman, for these bushmen from southern Africa, quote, hunted meat is very carefully distributed according to protocol. The tribal members who eat the meat given to them have a ritual to, in quotes, insult the meat. They make a matter of practice to be rude. Tribal members don't want the hunter to get too uppity. To prevent the idea of considering yourself to be better than anyone else is ferocious egalitarianism. When a young man kills much meat, a bushman told anthropologist Richard B. Lee, quote, he comes to think of himself as a chief or a big man, and he thinks of the rest of us as his servants or inferiors. We can't accept this. The insults are designed to, quote, cool his heart and make him gentle, end quote. For these hunter-gatherers, Sussman says, the sum of individual self-interest and the jealousy that policed it was a ferociously egalitarian society where profitable exchange, hierarchy and significant material inequality were not tolerated. So here's the final paragraph of the New Yorker article. This egalitarian impulse is central to the hunter-gatherer's ability to live a life that is on its own terms, affluent without abundance, without excess, without competitive acquisition. The secret ingredient seems to be the positive harnessing of the general human impulse to envy. And he says, in quotes, if this kind of egalitarianism is a precondition for us to embrace a post-labor world, then I suspect it may prove a very hard nut to crack. Hard nut to crack? Old chestnuts? How many times have I been told, and all of us, well, given my hard-headed realism, we've all heard these standardized utterances of mature judgment, common sense, or a simple, good luck on that one. Most often they're uttered to stop the conversation or end thought. Well, what about the likely fact that members of our own species came up with fierce egalitarianism? This is an example of something practiced and practiced. It's not an abstraction without a particular. maybe we need to find such examples. This is called Softball Rules at West Indianola, District 93. West Indianola, Soldier Township, Shawnee County, Kansas, some 3 miles from the Topeka city limits in the Kansas River Valley. From the front doors on the north side of the school, I could see the fields of my aunts and uncles, also the house and outbuildings where my grandparents had lived most of their married lives and raised their 4 children. I could see our own farm. That 2-room country school had 8 grades, 1 through 4 in the little room, 5 through 8 in the big room. No kindergarten. The school year lasted 8 months, not 9. When spring came, many school kids were expected to be on hand to help with getting the crops planted, harvested, or whatever else was needed at that busy time. The distribution of around 40 students in those 2 rooms was relatively equal. We had what we then called cripples in those days in our schools due to polio. Jonas Salk had not yet developed his preventative vaccine. 2 were children. The 3rd was Mrs. Wade, who taught grades 5 through 8 in the big room and also served as principal. The big room had an elevated stage, about 10 inches, I expect, and this was for the Christmas play and others. The large doors dividing the 2 rooms went up. 2 girl students, both younger than I, had difficulty walking because of their polio. One wore braces on both legs. The other had one crippled leg, which was shorter, causing her to walk with her hands splayed between the hip and knee. We took both of these fellow students as they were, and we made adjustments for their condition. When it came to recess, for example, we had different rules for them, and I'm pretty sure we students made them up to accommodate their limits, especially when we played softball. For Loretta, the one with braces on both legs, swinging the bat made it hard to keep her balance. She was entitled to 5 strokes. When she hit the ball, someone ran the bases for her. Betty Ann, with one limited leg, was quite steady on her feet and could swing all right, but could not really lean into the pitch, so she got 4 strikes. And again, someone else had to run the bases for her. We played what was, and maybe still is, called workup. With workup, there are no teams. At the beginning of recess, we lit out for home base on the ball field. The first to touch the base battled third, after Loretta and Betty Ann. The second one to touch the base became the catcher, the third the pitcher, fourth first base, then second, third shortstop, left field, center field, finally right field. If there were more, then they could fill in on the field. When someone was put out, everyone moved up in that same order. Sometimes we had it that when someone caught a fly ball, they exchanged with the batter. At other times, it was just an out. I can't remember how we decided how it was to be. But we had other rules. Over the fence was out. A half strike counted as a whole strike. That decision could lead to an argument. Jerry Blyer could hit a slow underhand pitch and send it over the fence. When he did, he was out and had to go to right field. This restricted Jerry to lower power hitting. Throws to first base on a grounder were often, if not usually, inaccurate. Any hitter was more likely to get put out on a fly ball than a grounder. I have no idea how the rules were drawn up. They were just there, like the school itself. We were mostly left alone on the field. Sometimes the teacher would call the balls and strikes, but not usually. The teachers usually talked with one another. The little room teacher was sure to hang around the little kids at the swings and teeter-totter. Some of the little kids wanted to play ball. When they pitched, they were allowed to shorten the distance between the pitcher's mound and home plate. Now and then the kid would get mad. He or she would insist that he or she had made it to base and was safe. The hue and cry represented a vote. And so in a pout, that kid might head to the swing set or the teeter-totter. We had other games, pum-pum, pull away, and with snow in the winter, fox and geese. By the time I made the 8th grade, it seems that everything changed. We had a new school, complete with gymnasium. No more softball. We roller skated in the gym. We played volleyball and basketball. The charming old 2-room school that both my mother and I went to was gone. My maternal grandfather, as a school board member, had encouraged the community to pay the cost of building the school in just 1 year, and they did. But now the old school, with its bell tower, which called us in for recess, was gone. And they added a hot lunch program. No more lunches in paper sacks to be blown up and popped after lunch outside on Friday. No more metal ducks and lunch pails. I think I was the last to ride my horse to school, but I felt sorry for Poncho standing out there all day tied up, so I gave that up. My mother in her day rode Topsy to the same school and released him. She would remove the bridle and Topsy would just run back home. In her days, there was no highway. She was born in 1894. No speeding cars. How softball rules were made in her time, she never said. But more needs to be said about that new school, which included a gymnasium and the newly established lunch program. I started 8th grade in the fall of '49, 4 years after Japan surrendered in August. The instruments and products of progress were on people's minds, but not so much on the minds of my parents and other older people who had weathered the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and remained thrifty and frugal. A little perspective here. All 4 of my grandparents were born before the Civil War and old enough to remember it. One grandmother from near Gettysburg shook Lincoln's hand at the Gettysburg Address. The other was born in the territory of Kansas at the time of Bleeding, Kansas, not far from Lawrence. She and her family hid in a cornfield when Quantrill and his fellow Confederates burned Lawrence and left more than 150 dead. Thrift and frugality were long in dying for such people. But even I could see extraordinary change underway. When the war started, our family farmed exclusively with horses. My 2 brothers had gone to the Pacific to fight the Japanese, my 2 older brothers. While they were gone, my father bought a Ferguson tractor with steel wheels. Steel was all one could get, given that all available rubber was needed for the war effort. We still had a team of mules and a team of horses. Somewhere in the midst of it all, we no longer had one of the mules and one of the horses, just Bill, the mule, and Bird, the horse. They became the team that we used to pull the wagon as we picked corn by hand. It had a 50-bushel capacity, and a good hand could pick a wagon load in the morning and load it with a scoop shovel, have lunch, pick another 50 bushels in the afternoon. That was a good day's work. After the war, Uncle Roy had borrowed Bill and Bird to pull the wagon as he handpicked his corn. On the stretch through the field, the team required no more command than get up and whoa. Bill and Bird were kept at Uncle Roy's place all during his corn harvest while picking during the day. Uncle Roy noticed that going one way, he had a hard time getting him to go, and on return, which would have been turned toward our farm, he had a hard time holding him back. They were homesick. This was in the fall, during pheasant season, probably early November. About 1 or so in the morning, old Bird got out from Uncle Roy's corral and headed to her home, our place along the highway. Just as she was crossing the road in front of her house, she got hit by a car carrying pheasant hunters returning from hunting in western Kansas. A following grain truck ran over her head. I saw her the next morning, dead along the highway. Before long, the dead wagon arrived. The driver tilted the bed and with a power winch attached to her hind legs, pulled her in and took her to the rendering works to be turned into dog food. Now we were down to Bill the mule. Sometime later, someone from the south, buying up the area's horses and mules, took them back to where I can't say, but I imagine it then to be Mississippi. After the war, we got a one-row Woods Brothers corn picker, later a two-row. One other memory that has to do with dramatic change. During the war, Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company built a tire factory 3/4 of a mile east of home along the highway. First on the north side of the road, then another on the south. Finally, they merged the two buildings, blocking two national highways, 24 and 40, which ran together through the area. This forced another road to be built at a right angle to go south and connect with another road. The automobiles and trucks, with their need for tires, had closed a stretch of two national highways. On that stretch of old road into town during the war, I could read the sign on the way to Sunday school: "To save tires, drive under 35. That part of the highway was now blocked. None of this change seemed right to me, and I've been asked several times, when did I become an environmentalist? My best answer may be then. Back to the school. Many decades later, thinking about empathy and sense of fairness, I realized that a kind of democracy was at work in the West Indianola softball field. Beyond that, no little league coach was necessary to teach us how to field a ball or to bat. No discipline that I can remember was imposed on the playgrounds by any teacher. So what was the gain from all of this now that the school bus carried the kids to and from school and we could get our exercise in the gym? We had a tractor, but Bird was dead and Bill had gone to the south, where I imagined him pulling a single-row cultivator like one we had, but in some cotton field. I had never seen a cotton field except in pictures in a geography book. Even so, I missed him, and I wondered if he missed me. I'm not a historian, and I doubt if I'll ever be asked when the U.S. began its decline. I can tell when it began for me. It began in my single-digit years when Bill and Bird left the farm to be replaced by a small Ferguson tractor with steel wheels, when a beautiful, totally adequate school was torn down and a new one built, which included a gymnasium for exercise, and before that, when a war effort allowed Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company to block a road that had two federal highway numbers. The decline began when an aggregation of kids with an interest in fairness, perhaps fueled by a post-war growth economy, lost a world of rural youth that accommodated young girls that had been stricken with polio. The growth economy really began to take off in those years. What about the elimination of polio? How you doing? Are you able to hear? Huh? Are you able to hear? Okay. So, what about the elimination of polio? Jonas Salk and his did the research that led to the vaccine and later the oral form of it. The question will be, how about that? Of course we're thankful for Salk's discovery. Why dwell on mere nostalgia, the question may be, when a practical necessity was on the line? Is that all part of what Morris, Behrman, means in his book, Dark Ages America, The Final Phase of Empire? Is that what he means when he calls it a package deal? If so, why? And how about what could have been a legitimate home run that went over the fence? How were the rest of us expected to feel the ball that goes out of bounds? As we think of social justice in a period of downpowering facing us, what is wrong with the idea? What is wrong with the idea that over the fence is out? I want to think about that. So finally, this is one page, double-spaced, 1 page and 3/4. This was written for the first land report and for December 1976. So it has not been altered, edited a bit. You can still find it. Anybody that has the first land report will be able to read this. So here it is. The title is Hardening Off. I once planted some seeds of a wild winter annual in small plots in a greenhouse. They were painstakingly watered and fertilized and produced a green, luxurious growth, surpassing in overall vegetative vigor their relatives in the field. From experience, it was known that if we moved these plants from the cozy greenhouse environment and left them outside, they would be vulnerable to the very environment which had shaped their ancestors. I'll go over that sentence again. We knew that if we took them out, they would be vulnerable to the environment that had shaped their ancestors and that had shaped the wild plants growing their own relatives. A high percentage would be unable to withstand the shock and might die, not because they lacked the genetic potential to resist the environmental extremes, but because the narrow greenhouse environment had not called forth the broad spectrum of genetic potential necessary to endure the adversity usually presented to wild populations. Were you all able to hear that? The United States as a developed country might be regarded as a greenhouse culture. Lately, we've been watching a gathering storm outside our comfortable environment and have become suddenly cognizant of how vulnerable our culture is. We lately anticipate that our cozy environment may fast disappear. In fact, only a few supporting subsystems responsible for our affluence need falter, and we will find ourselves out in the cold. There's a way to gradually prepare greenhouse plants for a full life outside. It's called hardening off. By placing the plants outside a few hours a day at the beginning and gradually increasing the amount of time they're left outside, eventually they can be safely left there. The first time they're placed outside on a quiet, warm afternoon, the outside environment may appear to differ very little from the greenhouse environment. But it's an important first step, and somehow it seems different. What we're doing at the Land Institute during this hardening off period is the equivalent of giving the plant the outside condition and the time to kick in the genetic machinery it has and needs to cope physically and psychologically with the outside world. One might say that our main purpose here at the land is to provide alternatives to the present for a cultural hardening off process. Student work on projects described on these pages, referring to the land report, may be no more than moving plants from a warm, still greenhouse to the outside on a warm, still day. But we hope most of our activity is a bit more than that. We know that if we jump too quickly into the world of the future, we might become so discouraged that we refuse to venture out again. We hope that one day we may regard being whipped by the wind as being touched by the earth rather than threatened with wilt. But that can happen only if we have been properly hardened off. So we're talking about a cultural change that has come about so fast. And I've tried to emphasize the speed that change has come. When I say that all four of my grandparents were born before the Civil War, and when I say my parents were born in the late 1800s, that's not long. And therefore, this time span of change, which has accelerated increasingly, the changing climate is something that if we imagine that our larger security for a future is a life in which social justice is paid attention to, even by kids that recognizing that over the fence is out, or a brother that asks such questions as, why do you need a new one here? Why won't this one do? Or, you see, you can go on and on and on. So to capture the cultural potential, again, much of that cultural potential that is lost is something we can do. And when we think about the praising of, or the saying bad things, insulting the meat, there's something there. There's something there. And also, I will say, having a kid willing to puncture a highfalutin sounding balloon.